At 6:47 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, a classified situation update quietly moved through several diplomatic and military channels in Washington, and according to officials familiar with the briefing, the United States may have just crossed a line in the conflict with Iran that could trigger a much wider geopolitical crisis. While most mainstream media outlets are still replaying yesterday's footage, new military escalation decisions are already being discussed behind closed doors in Washington, Tehran, and Tel Aviv. President Donald Trump has now issued one of the strongest warnings yet, signaling that U.S. military strikes inside Iran could expand to entirely new strategic targets. According to the president, American forces have already destroyed 42 Iranian naval vessels in just 3 days, claiming the operation has significantly weakened Iran's ability to operate in the Persian Gulf. But that's only part of what is unfolding. Over the last 24 hours, Iranian missiles and drones have reportedly struck areas across the Gulf region, including incidents near Dubai's international airport, as well as attacks affecting Kuwait and Bahrain. In an unexpected move, Iran's leadership even issued an apology to neighboring states, something analysts say rarely happens unless pressure inside the conflict has reached a dangerous threshold. And the real risk may not just be military. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow corridor responsible for nearly 20% of the world's oil supply, is now sitting on the edge of disruption. Energy officials are warning that if this conflict expands further, oil prices could surge toward $150 per barrel, sending shockwaves through the global economy. So before we go any further, subscribe to this channel right now, because by the time the mainstream media fully understands what's happening, the situation may already have moved to its next phase. Now, to understand why this situation is developing so quickly, we need to step back and look at the larger strategic picture that is unfolding behind the headlines. Because what we are witnessing right now is not simply a series of military strikes. It is the beginning of a multi-layered geopolitical confrontation that could reshape the balance of power across the Middle East and possibly the global economy as well. In this analysis, I'm going to guide you through 3 critical developments that most news coverage is only touching on briefly. First, we will break down the exact military escalation that has taken place during the first days of this conflict, including what the destruction of dozens of Iranian naval assets actually means for control of the Persian Gulf. Second, I will lay out the economic consequences that are already beginning to ripple through global markets, especially the growing fears surrounding the Strait of Hormuz, where nearly 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes every single day. And finally, I will present the strategic scenarios that intelligence analysts are quietly discussing, including how long this conflict could realistically last, and what Iran's long-term survival strategy might actually look like. Because when you connect these 3 pieces together, a much larger picture begins to emerge, one that suggests this crisis may be far from its peak. To understand why this conflict has escalated so quickly, we need to examine the situation systematically. Because what appears on the surface as a series of airstrikes and missile exchanges is actually the result of several strategic conditions aligning at the same time. When analysts inside defense institutions evaluate a conflict like this, they usually look at 3 key elements: military capability, economic leverage, and political endurance. And right now, all 3 are colliding. Condition 1, military superiority in the skies. The first and most obvious factor is the overwhelming military advantage currently held by the United States and Israel. Within just the first phase of the campaign, American officials claim their forces have destroyed more than 40 Iranian naval vessels in only 3 days, dramatically weakening Iran's operational presence in the Persian Gulf. Control of the air is everything in modern warfare. Once a military achieves consistent air dominance, it gains the ability to strike infrastructure, command centers, weapons depots, and transportation networks with relative freedom, and that is exactly what appears to be happening right now. Several former defense officials have pointed out that the current strategy resembles the early stages of previous air campaigns designed to paralyze an opponent's military coordination before any broader strategic decision is made. Former NATO commander Admiral James Stavridis once explained that in conflicts like this, the first objective is not necessarily immediate victory. Instead, the goal is to remove the opponent's ability to respond effectively. And if that is the strategy being applied here, the destruction of Iran's naval assets could be only the beginning. Condition 2, Iran's asymmetric response. However, military superiority does not automatically guarantee strategic success. Iran has spent decades preparing for a scenario in which it would face a technologically superior opponent. Instead of trying to match American military power directly, Iranian strategy has historically focused on asymmetric disruption. That means using tools that create instability without requiring conventional battlefield victories. Over the past several days, we have already seen examples of this approach. Missile and drone attacks have reached parts of the Gulf region, including areas near major commercial hubs such as Dubai. Even when these attacks are intercepted or cause limited damage, they still achieve an important strategic objective: uncertainty. Military historian Andrew Roberts has noted that in asymmetric conflicts, the weaker side often attempts to create psychological and economic pressure rather than purely military victories. If shipping routes become unstable, if airlines begin rerouting flights, if investors grow nervous about regional security, the economic ripple effects can spread quickly. In other words, Iran does not necessarily need to win battles to create consequences. Condition 3. The energy shock risk. The third and potentially most dangerous factor involves the global energy system. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most strategically sensitive waterways on the planet. At its narrowest point, it is only about 30 kilometers wide, yet nearly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through this corridor every day. Energy analysts have long warned that any major disruption in this channel could send shockwaves across global markets. Already, oil prices have surged significantly since the conflict intensified. Some energy officials have warned that if maritime traffic becomes seriously restricted, the price of crude could approach $150 per barrel, levels that would have dramatic consequences for transportation costs, inflation, and economic growth worldwide. Warren Buffett once famously described energy markets as one of the most powerful transmission systems of global economic pressure. When energy prices rise sharply, the effects ripple outward into food prices, airline travel, manufacturing, and consumer costs. And that is why this conflict is being watched so closely far beyond the Middle East. If you're beginning to understand just how serious this situation could become, go ahead and hit the like button right now. It really helps this analysis reach more people who are trying to make sense of what's happening. Because when we combine these three forces, military escalation, asymmetric retaliation, and the threat to global energy supply, the result is a geopolitical situation that is extremely volatile. But the most important question is not what has already happened. The real question is what happens next. And when analysts model the possible outcomes of this conflict, they usually narrow the future down to three potential scenarios. At this point, analysts studying the conflict generally agree on one thing: the next phase will depend almost entirely on what happens when the current escalation window reaches its limit. In military planning, every conflict has a moment when pressure reaches a decision point. And according to several strategic assessments circulating among defense observers, this confrontation may soon approach that moment. From there, three primary scenarios begin to emerge. Scenario 1. Strategic de-escalation. The first possibility is a controlled step back from the brink. In this scenario, Iran chooses to reduce direct confrontation, limiting its missile and drone activities while signaling a willingness to negotiate through regional intermediaries. Gulf states and international actors could then push for diplomatic channels aimed at stabilizing shipping routes and restoring energy flows. Meanwhile, the United States and Israel might declare that their objectives have been largely achieved, emphasizing the destruction of military infrastructure and claiming the operation successfully reduced Iran's ability to project power in the region. This outcome would allow both sides to frame the situation as a form of strategic success. Markets would likely stabilize, shipping through the Strait of Hormuz would gradually resume normal patterns, and oil prices could begin to settle back toward pre-conflict levels. However, this scenario requires both sides to accept a pause before the conflict escalates further, and that is far from guaranteed. Scenario 2. Limited ongoing conflict. The second scenario is perhaps the most realistic, according to many geopolitical analysts. Rather than ending quickly, the conflict settles into a prolonged cycle of limited strikes and retaliatory actions. In this situation, the United States and Israel continue targeting specific military facilities, command structures, and strategic infrastructure. At the same time, Iran responds through asymmetric tactics, launching occasional missile attacks, drone operations, and proxy actions across the region. This kind of conflict does not necessarily produce a decisive victory for either side. Instead, it becomes a war of endurance. Airspace restrictions continue to disrupt travel. Shipping insurance costs rise dramatically. Energy markets remain unstable. Investors become increasingly cautious about the broader regional economy. In short, the world begins adjusting to a new normal of persistent instability. Scenario 3. Full regional escalation. The final scenario is the one that concerns global strategists the most. If strikes intensify and retaliation expands, the conflict could evolve into a full regional confrontation. In that case, additional actors could become involved. Strategic infrastructure across the Gulf could face increased risk. Maritime routes through the Strait of Hormuz might become severely restricted or temporarily closed. The consequences would not remain confined to the Middle East. Energy prices could spike dramatically. Global shipping networks could be disrupted, and financial markets might react with significant volatility. In extreme projections, analysts warn that oil prices could surge far beyond current levels, triggering inflationary pressure across multiple major economies. And once a conflict reaches that level of escalation, controlling its direction becomes far more difficult, because wars rarely unfold exactly as their architects expect. So where does that leave the world tonight? The reality is that the clock is now ticking on a geopolitical confrontation that could reshape the balance of power across the Middle East. Over just a matter of days, we have already seen naval forces destroyed, missiles and drones striking across the Gulf, and the world's most critical energy corridor suddenly placed under intense pressure. What began as a series of targeted military operations is now evolving into something much larger, a test of endurance between military dominance and strategic survival, because for the United States and Israel, the objective may be to weaken Iran's military capabilities and force strategic concessions, but for Iran, the objective may be far simpler: survive the pressure, endure the strikes, and make the conflict costly enough that the opposing side eventually steps back. And that is why this moment matters so much. If escalation continues, the consequences will not stop at the battlefield. They could ripple outward through energy markets, global trade routes, and political alliances around the world. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think the United States has already crossed a line that could trigger a wider regional war? Or do you believe Iran has pushed the situation too far and forced this confrontation? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want to stay ahead of the next developments in this unfolding crisis, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the situation is changing faster than most headlines can keep up with.